All right, hello everybody. So this is our first lecture for week 2 for Monday, March 11th. So please be sure to take a look at the video before our next class, our discussion on March 13th, Wednesday, March 13th. Now, we're going to look at, in this part of the lecture, which I will upload and which will be recorded in several portions. This is part 1, and we're looking at the way that the Choson dynasty structured their government. So just to briefly give you some background information, when the Goryeo dynasty fell and was replaced by the Joseon dynasty, there were several problems of the Goryeo dynasty which eventually led to its demise. And the founders of the Joseon dynasty, they really wanted to correct those issues. And so they addressed several aspects when they decided to establish the Choson dynasty. The way that the central government was structured was basically very simple. There was the king, or the throne, and then the bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy was divided into two separate aspects. There were the military officials and there were the civil officials. The architects of the Joseon dynasty understood that they needed to implement widespread fiscal reform. So by the end of the previous dynasty in Goryeo, the government was facing a fiscal crisis. They just did not have enough income or revenue going to the government. Partially this was because of the state support of Buddhism. So these Buddhist temples had accrued large amounts of land and slaves, which were all tax-free. So at the beginning of the Joseon dynasty, there was a new land survey that was conducted, and this was in order to increase the amount of public land, or the land where tax would be redirected to the government instead of to private individuals. So formerly temple lands were confiscated and they were turned into public land. And in terms of military reform, so at the end of the Goryeo dynasty, there was a problem with local warlords, and they had their own private armies. And if they were opposed to the central government, then this would allow them to undermine the central government. So the Joseon dynasty abolished all private armies and they recreated a standing army that was countrywide and under the control of the central government. And then in terms of political institutional reform, I see that parts of this PPT are being are covered by this video, but the PPT will be uploaded to Blackboard, so you can also look at it from there. But there was political institutional reform that was conducted. So again, at the end of the Goryeo dynasty, one of the problems was that there was a concentration of power amongst just a few individuals. So the Joseon dynasty got rid of concurrent appointments. This means that one person could not hold more than one appointment at the same time. So if one person held several appointments or several high official positions, then this would then concentrate a lot of power in that one individual. And so to avoid that from happening again, they got rid of these concurrent appointments. They created a Council of State, and this Council of State was for policy formation, and they reported directly to the king. And then there were 6 ministries that were formed. Again, these were to report to the king, a new security council, a royal secretariat. The royal secretariat was responsible for document transfer between the throne and the government. And again, this agency reported directly to the king. And then there were the three agencies. These were largely for, one was the Inspector General, which was for surveillance, and another was to try to ensure that there was quality control amongst the government. So really, what this institutional reform tried to accomplish was to strengthen the throne. The power of the king had declined so much by the end of the Koryo dynasty that this was necessary to strengthen the throne and to even out the balance of power. And this included the dispersal of power. So again, strengthening the throne, but dispersing bureaucratic power. So making sure that the power amongst the government bureaucrats was distributed in a rather even way. But this meant that there were certain individuals, certain officials, particularly in high positions, that would lose their power. So why would the central officials go along with this? Well, there are several reasons. One is because of the implementation of Confucianism as state political ideology, but the other is because most of the officials understood that in order to have a strong government, it was necessary to have a strong king. If you had a weak king, then this often led to problems within the government, and so for the officials, it was better. They understood it was better to have a strong king. They also understood that it was better for the government as a whole to have a balance of power between the throne and the bureaucracy. So this is part of the reason why the central officials went along with it, but also because of the implementation of Confucianism as political ideology. We will go into Confucianism towards the end of the semester in more detail, but just to briefly give you an introduction to Confucianism, within the body of Confucianism, which is very large, there are hundreds and hundreds of schools of Confucianism, there are certain schools that focus on statecraft and the art of good government. So how the proper behavior of the king, the proper behavior of his bureaucrats, the proper relationship between the king and his officials. And so this is the kind of Confucianism that the architects of the Choson dynasty then focused on. It's based on ethical and moral principles. So the king is, through education and self-cultivation, supposed to be the highest moral example for both his ministers, his officials, and for the general population. And the king setting the moral example is really the key to creating a perfect society within this Confucian ideology. How does this occur? Well, the goal is to achieve stability and harmony. This is not about constant change and innovation, much like we see in modern times, but this is about creating stability, creating harmony, and creating predictability. So because according to Confucian ideology, social harmony is achieved when everybody understands what their proper role in society is, their responsibilities and their duties, and then acting appropriately according to that role. So for example, if you are the king, there's a certain set of behavior and expectations from you as the king, and it would be inappropriate for the king to behave like a merchant. Or if we take it down to the family level, there's proper behavior for the father and another set of proper behavior for the son, and how this father and the son interact with each other. There are certain expectations, reciprocal responsibilities and duties, and everybody must understand what their proper place is. And once everyone understands what their place is, then this is what creates harmony, this is what creates stability. And this general principle is applied all the way down from the family level to society, to the government, and also applied to how states interact with each other on a larger global level. Okay, so just to give you a brief overview, these relationships are based on the idea of the 3 bonds and the 5 relations. So the 3 bonds are between the ruler and the minister, or between the king and his officials, between parent and child, and between husband and wife. And the 5 relations are ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger, and between friend and friend. Now, all of these relationships are hierarchical. This is not about equality or egalitarianism or equal rights. These relationships are hierarchical. So to give you an example, in Confucianism, like Jushi, he believed that the parent was higher than the child. So when you look at the father-son relationship, the father and the son are not equal to each other. And so the way that they treat each other will be different, and the responsibilities that the father has towards his son are different from the responsibilities that the son has towards his father. And in Confucian ideology, this is natural. It is natural that the parent is higher than the child. And so even though it is hierarchical, you do have this superior-inferior relationship, within Confucian ideology, this is considered to be natural. And so everyone must understand what their role and their relationship is. Normally, a person will have many different roles. So a person can be a father and a son and a husband and an official and the older sibling. So each person holds many or wears many different hats. And in each situation, it is important for that person to understand what their role is in that particular relationship, and then how they must appropriately behave. So how you behave as a father to your children will be different how you behave as a husband to your wife, which is also different from how you behave as an older sibling to your younger sibling, etc., etc. So once everybody understands and displays appropriate behavior, this is what creates social stability and harmony. All right, so as I said, this is all hierarchical. Everyone has a proper place. How do you know how to behave properly? Well, it's through education and through self-cultivation. So by receiving a Confucian education, which then imparts upon you instructions on what the proper role is and what your responsibilities are. You do this by cultivating. But it's also really through ritual. So ritual in Confucianism is extremely important. And it is through ritual, by practicing the ritual, physically going through the ritual, that one then begins to understand better what their proper role is. And this kind of self-cultivation and education, it starts at the family level. So in Confucian ideology, the basic unit of society is the family. Whereas in Western societies, the basic unit of society is the individual. In Confucian societies, the basic unit is the family. And so understanding one's proper place and self-cultivating, this occurs at the family level. And once the family is properly regulated, then and as all the families are properly regulated, then society will be regulated. And then once society is stabilized and experiences harmony, then the government and the dynasty will experience harmony. So this is how it emanates outward. All right. The relationship between the ruler and the minister. So going back to the beginning of the Choson dynasty and how the government was structured. Because we have the throne and we have the bureaucracy, the main relationship is between the king and his ministers. And the king, as I mentioned, is to be the ultimate Confucian moral model. But who teaches the king? Right? So the king is an example, but who teaches the king? Well, that is the responsibility of his officials. So the officials too, because they are educated in the Confucian classics and they are also responsible for self-cultivation, there was a Royal Confucian Academy, or the Seongyungwan, which is where the crown princes went to be tutored and educated in Confucian ideology. And the teachers there were government officials. So these government officials, they would teach the king or the crown prince, and sometimes the kings would sit in on these lectures and participate in the lectures. But it was a way for there to be, to create discourse on this Confucian moral ideology. This is also somewhat of a way for officials to exert their influence on the crown prince and the king, because if they are inculcating the crown prince in what they consider to be proper Confucian ideology, then they're influencing the crown prince's education, how he thinks, and how this will apply later on to his rule of the country. And later on, when the crown prince then becomes the king, there is this influence. All right, so this is the end of this first part of the lecture, which just gives you a broad overview of how the government was structured during the Choson dynasty, and what principles they used or what principles that this government was based on. So stay tuned for part 2 of the lecture for next Monday.